Attention! Class, please take your seats. We'll begin shortly," announced the war instructor, his voice carrying the weight of countless battles. He was an aged Ralvic warrior, his body a map of scars and patches of missing scales, tangible reminders of the many conflicts he'd endured throughout his long life. Though his 3 remaining arms were still powerful, they moved with the slow heaviness of age and accumulated injury. As he scanned the room filled with students from various species, his gaze settled on the 10 humans seated at the back. They were all grinning, their teeth bared in that unsettling way, fully aware of the topic that would be covered today. He understood they meant no harm by showing their teeth like that, but it still sent a chill down his spine. Humans always posed a challenge when this particular subject was taught, their pride often difficult to manage. Yet, ever since the incident, the Intergalactic Alliance Military Academy had been mandated to include it in the curriculum. Today we will be studying the Terran Resistance. He sighed as he heard the human students laying out shouts of excitement, and one who stood up and shouted, "Hell yeah," so loud that everyone shrank in their seats due to the sound. "Cadet Paulson, calm down, or I will kick you out of my class. The same goes for the rest of you," he said sternly as he pointed to the humans. As you all know, the Terran Resistance came about in response to the Intergalactic Alliance's Deathworld Subjugation War. The reason that the Alliance felt the need for this war was due to the sudden increase in Deathworlders achieving FDL travel. It was rare for a Deathworld species to achieve FDL, but far from unheard of. However, during this period, a total of 20 Deathworld species had achieved FDL within 5 years of each other. This was concerning, and the Alliance feared that the Deathworlders had made alliances with each other and decided that the threat of them declaring war was too great to be left unchecked. "Cadet Malros, what is your question?" The cadet was a member of the Krillin, an insectoid species known for their hive-like structure under a single queen, yet possessing a rare degree of independent thought. Their carnivorous nature and formidable physical traits made them both unique and formidable. The cadet's dark red exoskeleton, nearly as hard as steel, and their 8 appendages, 4 for mobility and 4 ending in razor-sharp claws, were designed for both grabbing prey and increasingly as weapons. As the cadet spoke through a translator, the instructor was reminded of a battle long past, where a Krillin had been responsible for the injury that cost him his arm, which he presumed was consumed after the fight. How did so many Deathworld species achieve faster-than-light travel so rapidly, and were the Alliance's concerns overblown? The translator inquired. The question stirred the human students, who visibly itched to respond. The instructor, however, knew that he could not allow them to answer this time. "Humans, I know that you all know this subject by heart and wish to chime in, but I must remind you that this is my class, and if you interrupt without a question or without me asking you for an answer, you will be told to leave," he said as stern as possible. He then turned back to the rest of the class and continued. "To answer your question about whether the Alliance's fears were unwarranted, the answer is yes and no. The reason for this also answers your first question. The Alliance found that the Terran Empire was helping other Deathworld species achieve FDL, which is why they thought that they were forming alliances. However, while it was true that the humans were helping others achieve FDL, they only did so because they wanted to help others in open trade to resources that could only be found on Deathworlds. They also only did this with species that were non-violent or that had formed a lasting peace amongst themselves, and that were already close to space travel. They also never formed any formal alliances promising military aid. What resources could have been so valuable to the humans that they would risk war with the Alliance? Most planets have the same resources, just in different amounts, blurted out a cadet after the instructor had finished my explanation. This was a common question when it came to this topic. He sighed, knowing that the human cadets would be better able to answer this question. "Cadet Paulson, since you were so enthusiastic at the beginning of this lecture, would you like to answer the other cadet's question?" We were looking for minerals that were comparable to those of our planet. The reason for this is because while there are similar minerals spread throughout most habitable planets, those of Deathworlds are much stronger. This is because most Deathworlds have higher gravities, which leads to metals being stronger and more durable. An example of this is when comparing the steel of Earth to the steel of Kralkos. The steel of Earth has a higher carbon count, which makes it stronger than the steel on Kralko's. He finished looking pleased with himself. That's correct. The humans underestimated the risk of war because, while it was common for the Alliance to uplift various species and grant them faster-than-light travel, it had never been done with a Deathworld race. This was due to an unspoken rule. Most Deathworld species, known for their violent tendencies, were generally left to develop FTL technology on their own to avoid potential conflicts. As the Alliance realized the implications, debates erupted over how to handle the situation. Some advocated for glassing the Terran Empire's planets and resetting the other Deathworld races to pre-FTL conditions. Others pushed for the complete eradication of all Deathworld species. Ultimately, a consensus was reached to launch a military campaign against the Deathworlders, establishing an occupying force to regulate their use of FTL technology and dismantle their military capabilities until the perceived threat was neutralized. It was also agreed that if necessary, they would destroy any species deemed too dangerous. As he finished, he was notified by a timer that the class was over and he dismissed the class. Remember to review the Alliance's actions for the first year of the war, because that's what we will be discussing next time. As the war instructor walked into the classroom, he noticed that the class was much livelier than usual, which he had no doubt was the result of the readings over the first year of the war. However, what worried him the most was the apparent calmness of the humans and how steady their eyes were as they followed his movement. He had to fight his instincts to take a fighting stance, which normally took over when facing down a predator. He knew that this was because of the readings and what was about to be discussed. The war instructor cleared his throat and said, "Take your seats and be prepared for a quiz about the text you read." As the class sat down in their seats, he grabbed a stack of papers and began distributing them around the class. The quiz consisted of 20 questions, and once he got to the humans, he knew that they would ace the quiz, having been taught this topic since they were young. It always impressed him by how much their species remembered despite only living for about 100 years, and that the war was 400 years ago. As the final quiz was passed and he asked, "Now who can tell me what was the first species that the subjugation forces came into contact with, and what was the fate of the species?" The question hung in the air like it did every year, and he knew that it was because none of them wanted to admit what the Alliance did. Suddenly, Cadet Sully blurted out, "They first came into contact with the Aldrian species, and the Alliance forced them into slavery, making them strip mine their own planet to provide resources to the Alliance's subjugation forces. Then, after they rebelled, the Alliance decided to glass their planet and cause the extinction of an entire species." The anger was clear in her voice, and the instructor understood why. The human race had fought to end slavery in their own world because it was barbaric, so the topic of slavery always angered them. I don't think that it is fair to call it slavery. Yes, they were made to work and provide resources to the Alliance, but they promised their freedom after the war, and they were fed and were given compensation for their resources. Cadet Sarvin tried to explain. Her people were a canine species that were bipedal and were part of the occupying force for the Aldrian's planet. Because of this, they were always defensive about this topic, because even though they were only following orders, they got a lot of resentment because of this incident. "What are you talking about?" yelled Cadet Sully. Even if they were offered their freedom after the war, they would have been left with a planet devoid of resources and almost no way to find a new home, because they would no longer have control of their FTL travel, and that's if the Alliance would let them keep their FTL technology. Also, the food that they were given was about half of what they needed to stay strong, and the pay that they were getting was 4 times lower than what they should have gotten for their materials. Of course, a Norvek wouldn't understand that, considering that your people committed these acts. She spat with as much venom as she could muster. "My people were under orders. As someone who comes from a long military family, you should understand that we had to follow our order," cried out Cadet Sarvin with tears running down her face. "Yes, we understand the need to follow orders, but we also understand that some orders are not to be followed, especially when they would result in genocide," said in an eerily calm voice. The calmness in her voice was more terrifying than when she started screaming in class, and it made all the cadets shift as they prepared to run. The war instructor roared. Enough! Both of you! Sit down immediately or risk expulsion from the academy. As the cadets took their seats, he cleared his throat and continued. Cadet Sully, you are right that a soldier should disobey orders that are cruel and unjust. However, you must also consider the situation faced by Cadet Sarvin's people. When the war began, all Deathworlders outside the newly recognized 20 races were given an ultimatum. Join the conflict, face destruction, or be enslaved. Her people acted out of necessity to protect themselves, even if it required committing acts of extreme violence. As this statement hung in the air, Sully looked at Cadet Azric with a look of realization on her face, as she came to understand the choice that her people had to make. Now, how was it that the Alliance and subjugation kept the word of this from reaching the other Deathworlders until later, he asked. After no one answered for about a minute, still shaken by the new realization of the Norvek's impossible choice, he continued. Well, they used the typical protocol used when discovering a new race with FTL. They made contact with the government or governments and told them that if they wanted to join the Alliance, they needed to have any spacefaring craft and all members of the species back on their home planet. Normally, this is done so that no one from a new species can inadvertently break any laws and be charged for it, and this is what the Alliance told the Aldrians. However, this was used to bring the entire species to one place and then subjugate them and to stop anyone from getting word to the Terran Empire, he explained. As Cadet Sully said earlier, the Aldrians were forced into slavery and required to strip mine their planet and meet quotas for the war. The Aldrians was a bipedal reptilian species that had high bone and muscle density because of their gravity. They also had an outer layer of scales that were incredibly tough, and they could release a highly corrosive acid when threatened. As he was explaining, he brought up an image of an Aldrians so that the class could understand what they looked like. It was about 6 feet tall, covered in scales. It had long, thin legs that were designed to support its weight while on all fours or two. It also had a long tail, which was all muscle that could be used in a fight. Its arms were long but clearly strong based on the muscle structure, and they also had 3-inch claws at the end of each finger. Its face was the most interesting because it was a wide yet thin face, almost like a shovel. The reason that the Alliance decided that they would make good miners and should mine their planet had to do with their thin yet strong bodies, which would have made them good for small, cramped spaces which were common in mining caves. Another contributing factor was their ability to spit acid, which was able to eat through the rock, and because of this they saw it as an easy, cost-effective way to mine with as little machinery as possible, he continued to explain. As he paused, he looked around the classroom and could tell that they were waiting for him to get to the revolt and why the Alliance felt the need to wipe them out. That was when he saw the raised appendage. Yes, Cadet Malros, he said. He spoke into his translator for a minute, which then spoke. Why would they revolt when they knew that they could have been wiped out? If they had just done what was asked, they would have had a better chance at survival. He sighed and began to explain. The reason that the revolt started was just as Cadet Sully said. It was because they were underprovided for and not paid enough for their resources, and because it was destroying their home. So, they got word to their people around the planet in secret, and all agreed to attack and take any weapons they could from the Alliance. Also, the reason they did not want to take a chance that the Alliance would be merciful was that they had no reason to believe they would be. So, they decided it would be better to take matters into their own hands and fight for a chance at freedom. It is much like what the humans say. It's better to die on your feet than live on your knees. After the revolt began, the subjugation forces initially managed to hold the line, but the Aldrians were relentless. Gradually, they gained momentum and began to overwhelm the forces stationed on the planet. Once the Alliance learned of this development, they sent additional troops, extending the revolt by another 4 months. Ultimately, however, they concluded that the planet could not be held and withdrew their forces. As the Aldrians celebrated, the subjugation forces commenced glassing the planet to prevent any potential escape, he concluded. He then asked, "Are there any questions?" Noticing that the cadets were lost in thought, reflecting on the histories they had learned as children, he sighed and said, "We'll conclude today's class here. I realize it's a bit early, but it's clear that you need time to process this information. There will be no required readings tonight, and no quizzes in the next class. Have a good evening." As most of the cadets hurried out to their next activities, the instructor observed a group of humans approaching Cadet Azric. He stayed behind to ensure no conflict arose. Although he couldn't hear their conversation, he saw it end with a handshake and smiles, which led him to believe that Cadet Sully and the other humans had extended their apologies and made amends with the Norvek. This sight brought a smile to his face.